Harry Bentley never planned on sharing land with his ex-wife, least of all after the way things ended. Their divorce hadn't been explosive. There were no screaming matches, no threats, but it had been precise, surgical, and cold. Years of mutual disappointments had drained any sentiment that might have softened the severance. They both knew exactly what they were walking away from. What they didn't expect was a clerical oversight during the division of assets, a bureaucratic limbo involving a shared easement, a barn, and a strip of land that no judge had properly defined in their property decree. By the time either of them realized the mistake, they had already signed the documents. Correcting it would have required months of court motions neither had the time or energy to pursue. And so, they lived with it. Harry took the barn, a broad, weathered structure built in the 50s that had once housed livestock but now served as a mechanical workspace for Harry's modest rural repair business. Retired from contracting but not from work, he kept a tight schedule servicing agricultural equipment for nearby farms. It wasn't glamorous, but it paid steadily and gave him purpose. Joanna remained in the main house, a 2-story colonial she had painstakingly renovated room by room during their marriage. She ran a private therapy practice from one of the downstairs offices, catering mostly to women from nearby towns who wanted discretion and weren't interested in waiting lists or insurance forms. On paper, their lives had diverged neatly. In reality, their properties shared a single gravel path that ran directly between them, the only vehicle access to Harry's barn. At first, there were no issues. Harry worked early hours and respected Joanna's privacy, and she, in turn, avoided stirring the pot. But time, it seemed, eroded civility faster than they expected. Tensions began not with a blowout, but with silence, a deliberate, escalating quiet. When Harry would wave in passing, Joanna stopped responding. When he parked his truck on the edge of the shared driveway to load supplies, she'd text him passive-aggressive reminders about her client's need for a peaceful environment. One morning, Harry found the gravel recently swept to create a clean path, from Joanna's side to her front porch, his half of the drive left in natural disarray, as if to imply uncleanliness was a choice he'd made. The shift was small but unmistakable. They weren't coexisting. They were calculating. The real trouble started the day Joanna bought the Porsche. A used Cayenne, sleek, silver, still gleaming like it had just rolled off the lot. It was too much car for their road, Harry thought. She parked it neatly, directly in front of the barn doors, justifying it with a vague comment about sun angles and visibility. Harry didn't argue. He assumed it was temporary, maybe for the first week while she adjusted to its size, but the car remained there every day, unmoving, like an elegant barricade. At first, Harry worked around it. He rerouted deliveries to the side gate, parked his own truck farther up the road, even started loading his tools through the back of the barn. But it wasn't practical. The barn had been designed for wide entry access, not precision maneuvering. He began leaving notes under her windshield wiper, politely phrased but clear. No response. He tried knocking one afternoon. She opened the door only halfway and spoke through the crack saying she was on a call, that she'd get to it later. Later never came. 2 weeks passed, then 3, and the car was always there, silent, polished, empty. Harry couldn't decide if it was carelessness or malice. Maybe both. The final straw came on a Monday morning in late September, when a client called, needing urgent welding done on a combine axle. Harry gathered his tools, rolled open the barn's side doors, and wheeled the portable rig to the main exit, only to be greeted once again by the immovable presence of Joanna's Porsche. This time, he didn't try the notes. He stood in front of the car, hands on his hips, then turned around and walked the quarter-mile to his neighbor's property, where he made the repair in an open carport with no electricity, no cover, and just enough space to crouch. When he returned home, the Porsche was still there. That night he stared at the barn doors from his kitchen window. There was no reason for her to park there. None. Her own driveway had room for 3 vehicles. It wasn't shaded. It wasn't blocked. It wasn't more convenient. It was a message, and Harry had received it. They had been divorced for 3 years. 3 long years during which neither had reached out for reconciliation or reignited conflict. But now she was drawing lines. Not legal lines, not ones on maps or deeds, but psychological ones, territorial ones. It was a subtle war, and Harry had no intention of waging it with notes and polite reminders anymore. He spent that evening going over property records. He reread the easement clause in the divorce documents. It stated clearly that access to the barn was to remain unobstructed and freely usable by both parties in accordance with its historical function. It didn't name the gravel road, nor did it define what obstruction meant, but anyone with eyes and half a brain could tell what was happening here. He called a lawyer he'd used once before, a quiet man named Marvin Cray who specialized in boundary disputes. Marvin listened, took notes, and told Harry, "You're not going to win anything fast, and if she contests this, it'll take months, maybe a year. But yes, it's a case. You'd have to build a pattern of interference." Harry asked if welding a steel plate across his own barn door counted as provocation. Marvin sighed. "Let's start with documentation." So, Harry started filming. He bought a motion-activated dashcam and installed it on a post facing the driveway. He took photos. He timed her parking routines. He kept logs of when the car arrived, when it left, and how often she used it. But Joanna was careful. The car didn't always stay parked the whole day. Sometimes she moved it for just long enough to give the illusion of accessibility. Other times, she'd park it and then stand in front of it with a cup of tea, as if she were simply enjoying the view. He could feel the anxiety build in his shoulders every time he looked at the barn. His work was being affected, deliveries delayed, schedules missed, clients annoyed. One even hinted they might go elsewhere if he couldn't guarantee availability. The sense of helplessness crept in like mold. He'd spent his life as a competent man. Capable, self-reliant, the type who solved problems by rolling up sleeves and getting things done. Now he was playing watchdog on his own land, waiting for a woman he no longer loved to finish her silent game of chicken. The problem wasn't just the car. It was the silence, the refusal to speak, to justify, to acknowledge. Joanna knew exactly what she was doing, and the most infuriating part was how surgically clean her methods were. No confrontation, no raised voices. Just presence. Presence like a placeholder in a ledger, occupying space to deny someone else access to it. And Harry, patient as he was, knew patience had a cost. It cost time. It cost contracts. It cost dignity. There was going to be a line, and when that line was crossed, it wouldn't be with words. He had spent a career working with steel, bolts, beams, and flame. He knew the strength of materials. He understood tension. He understood what happened when a structure carried too much strain for too long and didn't flex. It cracked, and he was getting dangerously close to cracking. The morning it happened began with fog thick enough to dull sound. Harry stepped onto his porch just after 6, coffee in hand, staring at the pale outline of the barn down the slope. He couldn't even see Joanna's house through the mist, but he could feel its presence, just as one feels a toothache before the swelling. The gravel beneath his boots crunched faintly as he walked, the kind of sound that always made him feel grounded. When he reached the barn, he didn't even need to see it to know. Her Porsche was there again, centered perfectly in front of both doors, flush against the aged wood. It had been less than 12 hours since he last opened them to bring in a delivery of weld rods. She must have moved it into place sometime after dark. Harry stood silently, gripping his thermos, jaw tight. He didn't say a word. He simply turned around, walked back to his house, opened the cabinet above the fridge, and pulled out the heavy canvas pouch with the laser measuring tool he'd bought last spring. He went back outside and began recording distances. The width of the barn entrance, the length of the Porsche, the clearance left on either side. He made detailed notes on a clipboard, measuring the angle of approach, slope of the drive, and the specific turning radius it would require to block access completely. His handwriting was methodical, tight, without flourish. When finished, he took 20 high-resolution photographs from different angles, making sure to include time-stamped images showing the obstruction from the perspective of someone attempting to enter the barn. At exactly 8:15, Harry called Marvin Cray and left a message. No anger, just data, just the numbers. Then he did something he hadn't done in months. He drove into town to speak directly with someone at the local code enforcement office. The clerk behind the glass partition was polite but non-committal. She listened, took his printouts, scanned them without much expression, and said the matter likely didn't fall under municipal codes since it wasn't about permanent construction or utility blockage. It was civil. Private property. Civil. That word again. Useless. Frustrated, but not defeated, Harry visited the office of a process server named Lucian Beck, a tall man with the posture of someone used to standing on thresholds where he wasn't wanted. Harry explained the situation, keeping it short. He asked if Lucian would serve Joanna with an official letter of complaint, notarized, stating that she was interfering with access to business property. Lucien looked over the documentation and nodded. "This is clean," he said. "But it won't move fast, just so you know. She can ignore it unless you escalate." Harry nodded once. "I plan to." That evening, Harry returned to his property and found the Porsche gone. The doors to the barn were unobstructed, swinging open slightly in the autumn wind. It should have been a relief, but it wasn't. It was a move. A calculated one. Joanna never removed the car unless she wanted to give the appearance of compromise. It was a soft defense, a way of saying, "Look, there's no problem, you're imagining things." But he wasn't imagining the delay in shipments. He wasn't imagining the 2 rescheduled jobs this week, or the call he'd gotten from an old client in Bridgeton who asked if Harry was still active or slowing down. No. He wasn't imagining anything. The obstruction was real, and he'd documented it. He sent copies of everything to Marvin. He even uploaded the files to a cloud account just in case his computer ever failed. This was the kind of problem that didn't go away with apologies. It required record-keeping, consistency, and leverage. The next morning, things escalated. Harry came down to the barn to find a thick chain looped between the barn door handles and padlocked with a large, shiny, stainless steel lock that definitely wasn't his. At first, he simply stared at it. No note, no explanation, no key. The Porsche was gone, as if to mock the absence of obstruction while the door itself had been rendered useless. He walked around the barn slowly, trying every other access point, and found them all untouched. It was only the main entrance. His working door, the one used to haul large equipment that had been interfered with. He didn't call Joanna. That was a mistake he wouldn't make again. He didn't knock on her door or leave another note. He went back to his kitchen, retrieved a pair of bolt cutters, and returned. The lock was thick, stubborn, resistant even to hardened blades. He made 2 deep gouges in the shank before giving up, sweating through his shirt and realizing the only real option was cutting through the chain itself. As he worked, he noticed something strange. 2 deep tire impressions off to the side, as if a vehicle had pulled up not to park, but to observe. The grass was still depressed and faintly damp from the weight. The tread pattern didn't match Joanna's Porsche. This was a truck. He bent down, photographed it. Another data point. When the chain finally gave way and clattered to the gravel, Harry didn't feel victorious. He felt violated. This wasn't just passive aggression anymore. It was sabotage. Quiet, indirect, deniable, but sabotage nonetheless. He installed a second trail camera that night, high up in a pine tree, angled discreetly toward the barn. Its feed connected wirelessly to a hard drive in his office. No more guessing. He wanted proof. 3 nights later, just after 2 in the morning, the camera caught movement. A silhouette approached the barn from the tree line. Tall, hooded, cautious. The figure didn't attempt entry but walked up to the door, touched the handle, paused for a long time, then turned and walked away. No vehicle appeared. They came and left on foot. The footage wasn't clear enough to identify the person. It wasn't Joanna. That much he could tell, but he had no reason to believe she was unaware. Harry submitted the footage to Marvin and filed a formal report with the sheriff's office. The deputy who visited took a copy but warned him they couldn't do much unless property was damaged or stolen. "We'll log it," the man said, "but unless you've got an ID or catch them in the act, it's not likely we'll pursue." Later that week, Harry received a cease and desist letter from Joanna's attorney, claiming harassment, undue surveillance, and emotional distress caused by aggressive and confrontational behavior. Harry stared at the letter, mouth flat, heart steady. This was it. She was turning defense into offense. Preemptive strategy. Paint him as the threat, the man with tools and cameras and bolt cutters, the man whose anger might become a problem. And it would have worked if he hadn't spent the last month building a record. He forwarded everything to Marvin. "Don't respond directly," Marvin advised. "Let me take care of it. Stay clean. Stay calm. Don't touch her car again. Let her be the one to push." Harry agreed. He stopped all communication. He didn't wave. He didn't look at her house when he passed. He went about his business with the precision of someone who knew he was under observation. Because he was. And not just by Joanna. Someone else had taken an interest, and Harry didn't know why. But then came the email. A message from his insurance provider, flagging a new inquiry into the property, sent by an unnamed appraiser claiming interest in commercial zoning potential. Harry hadn't initiated any appraisals. He made calls. No one could trace the request. It had been masked through a broker, and suddenly it all clicked into place. Not conspiracy, not paranoia, just cold real estate logic. Someone wanted this land. Joanna wasn't just provoking him for sport. She was softening the ground, making it harder for him to operate, making it easier to force a sale. And Harry, quiet and deliberate as ever, realized something he hadn't admitted aloud. This wasn't just about a blocked barn door. This was a takeover, and she wasn't going to stop until he was the one who left. Harry didn't sleep the night after the insurance email. He sat at his kitchen table with a legal pad in front of him, drawing lines, arrows, and annotations that would make sense only to him. He'd always been a man of plans, not in the obsessive sense, but in the way people who've worked with machines long enough tend to see everything as a system. Inputs, outputs, tolerances, limits. But what he was facing now wasn't mechanical. It was psychological, legal, territorial. A war waged with paper, parked vehicles, anonymous calls, and shadowed moves in the night. He wasn't losing yet, but he was being pushed back inch by inch, like erosion grinding down the edge of something once solid. What he needed wasn't brute force. It was leverage. Something that would change the direction of pressure, something undeniable. 2 days later, that opportunity presented itself, not by chance, but by pattern. Joanna's Porsche had returned to the barn, this time parked slightly askew, almost as if placed carelessly. But Harry knew her better than that. Joanna didn't do careless. Every teacup in her cabinet faced the same direction. Every blouse was arranged by color. This was theater, an invitation to confrontation, so he ignored it. He didn't touch the car, didn't even acknowledge it. Instead, he called Lucian Beck again, the process server, and asked him to observe. Not serve, just observe. Lucian arrived 2 hours later in an old Dodge SUV and parked at the edge of the field where the pine trees gave partial cover. He brought binoculars, a digital camera, and a cooler with 2 sandwiches and a flask. Lucian didn't talk much, and Harry appreciated that. For the next 6 hours, Lucian watched. He recorded everything. Joanna's car remained unmoved. No one came or went. At dusk, Lucien drove away and said, "You'll have what you need by morning." The following day, Harry received a time-stamped document with 15 photos and an affidavit. The Porsche had obstructed access to the barn for over 7 continuous hours during standard working time. That meant something to a judge, and Marvin Cray agreed. He filed an official complaint under obstruction of commercial activity and a breach of shared easement use, citing evidence and attaching Lucian's affidavit. Joanna's lawyer responded within 24 hours with a flat denial and a counterclaim that Harry was harassing her by surveilling her movements and weaponizing litigation as intimidation. Marvin shrugged. "Expected," he said. "This is where it gets sticky." Harry understood sticky meant time, but while the law crawled forward, he still had work to do. So he did what he always did when control was threatened. He adapted. He rerouted all future deliveries to a neighboring plot owned by an old friend, leasing a temporary lean-to for storage. It cost money he hadn't planned to spend, but it bought him peace. Or rather, it bought him space to think. The barn, now intermittently blocked, became symbolic more than functional, a reminder of how power could be exercised through inertia. He didn't try to enter it anymore. Instead, he began using a small portable station he'd set up in the rear of his property, mostly for welding and engine diagnostics. It was primitive but serviceable. Joanna, for her part, didn't escalate immediately. Instead, she pivoted. One morning, Harry received a notice from the County Environmental Services Office stating that a complaint had been filed regarding unlicensed mechanical operations on agriculturally zoned land, citing concerns about chemical runoff and noise pollution. It was written in dry, bureaucratic language but packed with implications. Violations, fines, revocation of agricultural use status. It wasn't just a slap on the wrist, it was a loaded weapon aimed at his livelihood. Harry called the number listed and spoke with a county inspector named Devin Malloy. Devin seemed disinterested, as most overworked civil servants were, but promised to schedule an inspection within a few weeks. Harry didn't wait. He spent the next day preparing. He cataloged every chemical he used, weld gas cylinders, grease, oil, detergent, and made a spreadsheet showing quantities, storage conditions, and disposal practices. He took photographs, gathered receipts from the waste services company that handled his disposals, and prepared a binder thicker than most realtors' listing books. When Devin finally arrived, clipboard in hand, Harry walked him through every inch of the workspace. Devin, a man in his early 40s with thinning hair and a slow blink, flipped through the documents and nodded occasionally. At the end of the inspection, Devin said, "You're cleaner than half the schools I've seen. I'll file a no-violation report." Harry thanked him, but the relief was short-lived. He knew what this was now, a siege. Death by 1,000 paper cuts. He would counter every complaint with proof, every accusation with documents. But he also knew that Joanna's goal wasn't necessarily to win legally. It was to exhaust him, to drain the time, money, and will out of him until he either sold, gave up, or made a mistake. And then came the drone. It happened just after dusk. Harry was locking up the lean-to when he heard the soft buzz, like a large wasp circling overhead. He looked up and saw the blinking red light drifting above the tree line, hovering briefly over his yard before drifting west toward Joanna's property. He didn't own a drone. He didn't need to guess whose it was. He stood still, arms crossed, letting it watch him. The next day, he installed a motion-sensitive light tower aimed skyward. It wasn't a threat. It was a statement. He wasn't hiding. Then came the letters. Over the course of 5 days, Harry received 3 anonymous complaints. one to the county tax board suggesting he was underreporting his business income, one to the local zoning committee suggesting he had unapproved structures, and one to his insurance provider stating his equipment storage created a fire risk. None of these were signed. All were postmarked from out of county, but the timing was too neat, too exact. Marvin suggested backing off. "We've got your case filed," he said. "Don't give them ammunition. Let the process work." Harry nodded, but knew that passivity would invite further aggression. So he responded in his own way. He contacted an appraiser, had the entire property mapped, and commissioned a third-party survey to mark all legal boundaries with industrial stakes, metal rods driven into the ground with numbered plates and GPS coordinates. When the survey team arrived, Joanna emerged from her house, arms crossed, watching them from the porch. She said nothing, just watched. 2 nights later, Harry found deep scratches on the side of his truck. Not random, not chaotic. Parallel. Intentional. Like someone had taken a key and drawn 4 perfect lines down the driver's side. He filed a report, added it to the binder. No cameras had caught it, no witnesses, no case. He didn't retaliate. He did something worse. He began drafting a construction proposal. Not for a wall, but for a structural steel barrier to be bolted into the ground in front of the barn. Not a gate, a barrier. It would look like part of the barn. Joanna's car, if parked there again, would be sealed inside. Not damaged, not moved, but contained. He showed the draft to Marvin, who raised an eyebrow. "It's legally risky," Marvin said, "but if it's on your property, if it doesn't touch the vehicle, and if it's a static structure, it's not destruction, it's an enclosure." Harry nodded. "That's the idea." Marvin closed the folder and looked up. "You understand this escalates things. She'll go nuclear." Harry said nothing. He was past concern, past fear. He didn't want revenge, he wanted silence, a return to order, and if he couldn't get it through law, he'd get it through design. Steel, concrete, permanence. He made the first materials order that night, delivery scheduled for next week. It wasn't war anymore. It was engineering. The morning the materials arrived, Harry was already awake, seated at his desk with a mug of lukewarm coffee and his work gloves folded beside him like a symbol of restraint he was getting tired of respecting. The truck rumbled up the gravel drive at 8:04, carrying a steel delivery marked with his name and coordinates. The driver didn't ask questions, just signed off, dropped the bundle beside the barn, and left without ceremony. What Harry now had was enough to weld a permanent frame flush into the barn's support beam, reinforced along the gravel line, and sealed at ground level with poured anchor bolts. It wasn't a cage. It was a lock. An architectural consequence. It would not touch the Porsche, not damage it in the legal sense. But once in place, it would be impossible to move the car without dismantling the frame. And to dismantle it, you'd need to breach his property line and tool shed, which were both surveilled and fortified. It wasn't revenge, it was redirection. It was boundary redefinition in the most literal, physical sense. Harry didn't act that day. He waited. The Porsche wasn't there. Joanna hadn't parked in front of the barn for 2 days, and he refused to make his move until the act would be reactive, not aggressive. He had learned, painfully, that perception mattered more than principle. In this fight, optics were leverage. So he watched. 3 days passed, then 4. On the 5th morning, the Porsche returned, parked not quite centered this time, almost lazy in its positioning, like a careless afterthought. Harry stared at it from his kitchen window for a full hour before moving. He made no calls, left no messages. He didn't even notify Marvin. The permit for exterior stabilization had already been filed under structural maintenance. The blueprints had been pre-approved. All he needed now was to act. It took 6 hours. He started with the anchor plates, bolting them into the base of the barn frame, 2 feet from either side of the doors. From there, he welded vertical beams upward, bracing them to the cross supports he had pre-drilled the week before under the pretense of weatherproofing. He moved slowly, carefully, working with industrial precision. When he laid the final horizontal beam across the opening and sealed it in place, the effect was startling in its simplicity. It didn't look like a prison gate. It looked like an architectural reinforcement. Solid, deliberate, clean. Behind it, the Porsche sat trapped. Not harmed, not touched, but enclosed, encased within a frame of steel and certainty. By the time he finished, the sun was low, casting long shadows that stretched toward Joanna's house like accusatory fingers. He cleaned up, locked the welders in the shed, and returned to the house. He made dinner. He didn't look toward her window. That night he slept. No noise, no drone. No headlights slicing through his blinds. Only stillness. The next morning, she came. He heard the slam of a car door first. Then the heels, sharp, fast, deliberate, crunching over gravel. By the time she reached the barn, Harry was already outside, gloves in hand, leaning against the porch post like a man watching weather roll in. Joanna stood in front of the steel frame for almost a full minute, arms folded, body stiff. Then she turned, walked halfway to the porch, and said with no preamble, "What the hell is this?" Harry didn't answer right away. He stepped down from the porch slowly, stopping a few feet from her. "It's structural reinforcement," he said calmly. "Legal. Filed. Pre-approved. Doesn't touch the vehicle." She narrowed her eyes. "You think this is funny?" He shook his head. "I think this is resolved." She exhaled a hard breath, jaw tight. "You welded my car into your barn." "No," he replied. "I welded my barn shut. Your car was in the way. Again." The silence that followed was heavy, measured. Her face didn't twitch, but her hands tightened. She didn't yell, didn't accuse. She turned without another word and walked away. That was what told Harry he'd struck something deeper than rage. He'd shifted the field. She was calculating her next move. And she made it that afternoon. At 3:12 p.m., 2 uniformed deputies arrived on the property, slow-stepping their cruiser up the drive like a patient animal approaching uncertain territory. Harry met them at the gate. They were courteous but formal. "We received a complaint about possible vehicle entrapment and illegal obstruction," one of them said. "We just want to have a look." Harry said nothing. He led them to the barn, presented his permit copy, explained the construction timeline, and showed where the steel frame had been installed without contacting the vehicle. The officers examined everything, asked a few basic questions, took photographs, and left without incident. "If it goes to civil court, we recommend you retain counsel," one of them said. "But criminally, this isn't our lane." That night, Harry opened a bottle of bourbon he'd been saving and sat on the back porch watching the stars emerge. There was no movement from Joanna's house, no calls, no notes, no emails. But he knew silence wasn't surrender. It was absorption. 2 days later, a certified letter arrived. Joanna had filed for injunctive relief, claiming unlawful obstruction of property, interference with personal transportation, and psychological duress. Her filing was sharp, strategic, layered with citations and claims of prolonged mental stress due to escalating hostile acts. Marvin read the papers slowly, lips pursed, and said, "They're not going for damages. They're going for removal. She wants the court to force you to dismantle it." Harry nodded. "What are the odds?" Marvin was silent for a long time. Then, "It depends how tired the judge is that day." It wasn't reassuring, but it was honest. And yet, for all the legal noise, something had changed. Joanna didn't return to the barn. Her Porsche remained inside the frame for nearly a week before a flatbed tow truck arrived, carefully maneuvered in reverse through the side of the property, and pulled the vehicle out under Marvin's supervision. No words were exchanged. No glares. Just quiet extraction. Harry stood inside the barn that night and ran his hand along the steel beam. The space felt heavier somehow, like it remembered the conflict. The air was stale, the smell of oxidized metal lingering like old resentment. He didn't dismantle the frame. He left it in place. Not as a barrier anymore, but as a boundary. A reminder. A line no longer theoretical. Outside, dusk gathered along the field line, and Harry lit the old lantern on the porch for the first time in months. A small, warm glow in the cooling dark. Not victory, not peace, but presence. And sometimes that had to be enough. The extraction of the Porsche should have marked the end of the conflict. The vehicle was no longer present, the structure remained untouched, and for the first time in weeks there was open air between Harry's barn and the path that led to his work. And yet, despite the absence of physical obstruction, the air felt heavier than before, charged not with confrontation, but with calculation. Harry knew that removing the car wasn't a concession. It was a redirection. Joanna wasn't done. She was reloading. Within 72 hours of the tow truck's visit, Harry received a notice of citation from the County Building Compliance Division. It claimed that his unauthorized frame structure constituted a potential violation of the local visual conformity standards, citing a clause buried deep within a municipal code passed 15 years prior. The language was vague enough to be manipulated, clearly engineered not to punish large-scale violations, but to be weaponized by those who understood the value of bureaucracy as a tool of attrition. The letter required Harry to appear before a local zoning review board to determine whether his structural addition met the town's expectations for aesthetic integration within shared residential corridors. He brought the letter straight to Marvin, who read it twice before letting it fall gently onto the desk. "This is fishing," he said. "They're hoping you'll remove the steel to avoid the hassle, but if you comply, they'll take it as precedent." Harry didn't flinch. "I'm not taking it down." Marvin nodded. "Then we fight it." The review hearing was scheduled 10 days later. Harry arrived wearing a dark button-down shirt and clean work boots. He brought photographs, contractor statements, documentation of the prior permit, and Lucien Beck's original affidavit regarding the obstruction history. Across the aisle sat Joanna's attorney, a younger woman with clipped vowels and a laptop open in front of her like a weaponized shield. Joanna herself didn't appear. Her absence said everything. This wasn't personal anymore. It was systemic. The hearing was formal, measured, tedious. Board members, mostly retired professionals and part-time contractors with minimal architectural experience, asked narrow questions. Was the frame painted? Did it affect the view? Had any neighbors complained? One asked whether the structure could make someone feel trapped if they were inside it. Harry nearly laughed. Instead, he handed over photographs showing that the barn had been used safely, that the frame didn't interfere with operations, and that no property line had been violated. When asked why the structure was necessary, Harry replied flatly, "To prevent further illegal obstruction of my access to work." It was the first time the room fell quiet. A week later, he received a letter. No violation found. No order to remove the frame. The board had ruled in his favor. But victory was no longer satisfying. He hadn't won anything, just maintained a line that should have never been under siege. And yet, Joanna didn't escalate immediately. For a brief, cautious moment, Harry allowed himself to believe that the tide had turned. The barn remained untouched, the driveway clear, no letters arrived, and even the drone, silent for weeks, did not return. He focused on his contracts, caught up on delayed repairs, even replanted the garden strip near the edge of the barn. He didn't forget, but he allowed himself to breathe. That ended on the day the county assessor showed up, unannounced, clipboard in hand, with an assistant trailing behind carrying a measuring wheel. Routine property update, the assessor explained, smiling thinly. We're reclassifying mixed-use parcels, checking boundaries, assessing improvements. Should only take 20 minutes. Harry didn't stop them. He watched, measured their movements, noted where they lingered, at the frame, at the lean-to, at the gravel perimeter. He asked a question casually. Who initiated the reassessment? The assessor smiled again, the kind of smile designed to avoid truth. We're covering this whole sector, he said, but Harry saw the lie in his eyes. 3 days later, a revised property tax estimate arrived, 28% higher than last year. It cited expanded commercial utility footprint and recent structural additions. Marvin read it and sighed. This isn't just zoning now. She's going after your wallet. Harry wasn't surprised. He filed an appeal, requested a temporary freeze on rate changes pending review, and began documenting usage logs to counter the assumption that the lean-to and barn were being used for high-volume commercial work. It wasn't difficult. He kept those logs already. But each layer added time, expense, friction. And friction, he realized, was the entire strategy. Then came the neighborhood association. He'd never been a member. His property had originally been carved from farmland, technically outside the boundaries of the subdivision Joanna belonged to. But she had joined years ago when their marriage was still intact, and now, somehow, the association was contacting him directly, citing his proximity participation and requesting he attend a compliance mediation session. The letter was not a legal summons, but its tone was deliberately vague, designed to suggest obligation where there was none. Marvin reviewed it and confirmed it was meaningless, but it came with an attachment, a collection of signatures from nearby residents, citing persistent tension, noise disturbances, and visual discord related to Harry's property. Harry knew only one of the names on the list. The rest were strangers, newer arrivals, likely drawn in by Joanna's carefully tailored explanations and curated complaints. He didn't respond, but the message was clear. The fight was no longer private. Joanna had weaponized community, and so Harry responded in kind, not with retaliation, but with exposure. He began gathering his own testimonies, not dramatic accusations, but calm, documented statements from vendors, clients, and neighboring farmers attesting to his professionalism, reliability, and quiet operation. He compiled them into a digital archive and added them to the appeal materials for his tax case, reinforcing that his land was neither an eyesore nor a hazard. He wasn't trying to win popularity. He was building insulation. But even insulation thins under pressure. One evening, while returning from a job site, Harry found his mail shredded and scattered down the drive. Not just tossed, torn deliberately, even bills and legal documents. He retrieved what he could, reported it to the postal inspector, and installed a locking mailbox the next morning. The next week, tire tracks appeared in the outer field, as though someone had driven through under cover of darkness, looping once before retreating. He didn't call the police. He didn't need a report. He needed clarity. So he changed the cameras, installed new sensors, wired infrared trail lights that would trigger quietly without broadcast. It wasn't paranoia, it was protocol. And then, at 4:11 a.m., on a Monday, his motion sensors caught 3 figures on foot walking across the edge of his property, slow, deliberate, scanning the barn perimeter with flashlights. They didn't attempt entry. They didn't damage anything, but they left behind a single item, a laminated copy of the original barn permit with the words, "Under investigation," stamped in red ink across the top. It wasn't official, it wasn't legal, but it was left in plain sight. Harry didn't call Marvin. He didn't send the footage to the sheriff. He burned the copy in a fire barrel behind the shed and sat in a folding chair until sunrise, shotgun cradled across his lap. Not out of fear, but out of understanding. This wasn't about winning anymore. It was about survival, ownership, presence. Joanna wanted him off the land, not by eviction, but by erosion. She wanted to make the land more burden than home, more hassle than haven. But Harry had worked too long, too hard, for too little to abandon it now. The barn, the beams, the bolts, these were not just tools, they were statements, and he was prepared to reinforce them, line by line, weld by weld, no matter how long it took. It began without sirens, without lights, and without voices. Just a hollow knock on the door at 6:07 a.m., the kind that doesn't repeat itself, doesn't wait for acknowledgement, just exists as a signal. Harry opened the door to find two men in navy windbreakers, badges tucked at their waists, clipboard in hand. One introduced himself as a fire marshal, the other as a representative from the local emergency services office, both operating under the pretext of a routine inspection due to a community complaint alleging potential safety violations involving compressed gas storage and limited emergency egress around a reinforced outbuilding. The phrasing was clinical, precise, and unmistakably coordinated. They weren't asking. They were informing. Harry said nothing, stepped aside, and let them do their work. They didn't touch anything. They simply circled the barn, pointed at various features, took photographs, made notes, and asked a single question. Was this steel frame installed with fire code compliance in mind? Harry answered plainly. It was installed under an approved structural permit. The marshal wrote that down, nodded once, and told Harry he'd be notified within 5 business days if any further action was required. They left just as quietly as they arrived, their tires crunching back down the gravel with the same finality with which they'd appeared. Harry stood in the yard long after they were gone, not angry, not even frustrated, but aware. This wasn't the climax of some dramatic standoff. It was the tightening of a slow noose. The complaint hadn't come from Joanna directly. It didn't need to. At this point, she had engineered enough plausible distance to ensure that the system would do the pressure work for her. He was being framed not as a nuisance, but as a risk. The narrative was shifting, from territorial dispute to community hazard. And once perception hardens into public concern, even neutral bureaucrats begin to lean away. Marvin called that afternoon, already informed by a contact in the zoning office. It's not an enforcement move, he said. It's exploratory. They're testing your footing. Don't flinch. Harry didn't flinch. He documented everything, reinforced his compliance logs, and sent certified letters confirming his storage practices met code. But he also began removing all non-essential materials from the barn. Anything that could be spun as flammable, unstable, dangerous. Not because he was guilty, but because he was eliminating ammunition. He stripped the place to its functional bones. Tools, equipment, welders, nothing more. He made it uninteresting, unusable as a target. But he knew, deep down, that neutralizing the structure wouldn't defuse the war. That came 2 nights later. At 2:18 a.m., the lower motion sensor triggered. Harry, already half awake, rose without hesitation, slipped on boots, grabbed the heavy flashlight and the shotgun, and moved toward the barn with calculated steps. The air was humid, the kind that held sound in strange ways. As he crossed the slope, he saw it. The silhouette of a figure near the steel frame, crouched, doing something to the bolts. Harry didn't shout. He moved faster, circling wide until he was 20 feet away and angled to intercept. The figure sensed movement, turned and froze in the beam of Harry's flashlight. A young man, 20s, unfamiliar, wearing gloves and a black hoodie with no markings. There was a wrench in his hand. The steel beam had been partially loosened at the lower joint. Harry didn't raise the gun. He just said one word. "Why?" The man didn't answer. He dropped the wrench and ran, not toward Joanna's house but toward the tree line, toward the road, the exit, the unknown. Harry didn't follow. He retrieved the tool, checked the beam, and retightened the bolt on the spot. His hands were steady, even as his chest surged with the realization. This wasn't petty vandalism. This was targeted dismantling, with someone physically sent to breach a structure that legally couldn't be touched, which meant Joanna, or someone acting on her behalf, had moved from pressure to interference. Marvin came the next morning. He reviewed the camera footage, studied the footage frame by frame, and said, "You can press charges. We can file for a restraining order, but it'll lead to discovery. She'll claim she had no involvement." Harry nodded. "Let's file anyway." Marvin did. He submitted the footage, the affidavit, and the timeline of harassment. But even as the legal wheels turned, Harry knew this wasn't about courtrooms anymore. This was now about endurance. How long he could hold his ground. How long he could afford the fight. Not just financially, but psychologically. And then came the final turn. 3 days after the attempted breach, Harry received notice that Joanna had filed a petition to partition the shared portion of the property, citing irreconcilable tension and sustained obstruction of residential peace. Her goal was clear. To legally force the sale and division of the land, to end the shared access by compelling a court-ordered boundary adjustment that would either buy her the barn side or push Harry to purchase the rest at inflated value. If he couldn't afford either, the court could mandate the property's sale and split the proceeds. It was the nuclear option, and it was brilliant. Marvin didn't hide the gravity of it. If the court agrees that shared ownership has become untenable, they might grant the petition. You could be forced into a buyout or a sale. Harry stared at the papers, hands flat on the table. What's the timeline? 60 days to respond, then hearings. 3 to 6 months before resolution. You'd need to show that the shared access has not interfered with her quiet enjoyment of the land, and that you've acted in good faith. But I'll be honest, this is an uphill climb. Harry didn't answer right away. He looked out the window toward the barn, toward the steel, toward the battered earth that had soaked up every step of this war like dry ground drinks rain. And then he said slowly, "What if I don't fight it? What if I buy her out now?" Marvin blinked. "Do you want to?" Harry didn't smile. He just nodded. "I want her gone. I want the ground to stop shaking." The next week he made an offer, not generous but fair, all cash, clean terms, no negotiation. Joanna rejected it. Of course she did. It was never about the price. It was about the break. She didn't want compensation. She wanted withdrawal. And so, for the first time since the divorce, Harry went public. Not on the news, not with theatrics, but through formal petition, filing a motion to acquire full ownership based on interference, sabotage, and obstruction. He submitted documents, affidavits, timestamps, photographs, everything. It wasn't emotional. It wasn't angry. It was procedural, relentless. And the court, weary from the mess, finally blinked. The judge didn't grant full acquisition, but he offered arbitration. And in arbitration, Joanna blinked back. 3 weeks later, she signed the papers. She would retain the main house for a brief leaseback period, then vacate. Harry would acquire the entire parcel, including access, barn, and boundary rights. No appeals, no press. Just a handshake through attorneys and a closing date. Harry stood in the barn the night after the deal was finalized, hands in his pockets, the steel frame still standing like a relic of a war barely ended. It was quiet. No footsteps, no engines, no flashlights, just the sound of settling wood and wind moving gently through the eaves. He didn't feel victorious. He felt still. And that was enough. The morning she left, there were no final words, no glances, no attempt to punctuate the departure with sentiment. A rental-moving truck idled quietly in the drive at 8 a.m., and by 9:15 it was gone, taillights shrinking into the low fog that hovered across the far tree line. Joanna didn't look back, and Harry didn't watch from the window. He was in the barn, reorganizing tool drawers with the deliberate care of someone tending to small order after long chaos. Outside, the gravel settled where her car had once rutted the ground, the sharp-edged tire marks slowly smoothed by wind and time. There was no ceremony in it, just space reclaimed, presence receding like a tide that finally stopped trying to drown the shore. For the first time in almost a year, the property was quiet in the way land should be, unoccupied, undisturbed, intact. But that silence didn't arrive like relief. It came like an unfamiliar guest, too welcome to reject, too foreign to trust. In the days that followed, Harry walked the borders of his land with a surveyor's precision, not because he needed to confirm its shape, but because he needed to feel its scale. It wasn't large by any rural standard, just under 3 acres, but it had once felt claustrophobic, a battlefield reduced to footage and fractions. Now it felt dimensional again. Every corner had been touched by conflict, every structure challenged, every access point tested, but none of it had broken. That mattered. It mattered more than any legal filing or arbitration victory. The barn stood, the frame stood, and more importantly, so did he. The war had ended not with celebration, but with withdrawal. And Harry, who had never sought conquest, found himself in possession of a piece that was earned, not given. He didn't dismantle the frame. Many expected him to. Marvin asked about it in passing during their final meeting, and even Lucian, dropping off one last notarized document, gestured toward the barn and said, "Guess you don't need that anymore, huh?" But Harry shook his head. "It stays," he said. "It's part of the building now." And it was, welded not just in metal, but in meaning. Not as a trap or a provocation, but as a boundary forged under pressure, one that had held when everything else was tested. He repainted it matte black, bolted a narrow plank across its center as a mounting point for a new lockbox, and left it there. Not open, not closed, just steady. A part of the barn, and a part of the story. He resumed work, slowly at first. Contracts that had been paused resumed with cautious curiosity. The neighbors, those who had once murmured signatures and complaints, returned to silence. Some offering nods in passing, but most simply staying away. That suited Harry. He had no appetite for reintroductions. He made deliveries, accepted parts, and kept his hours predictable. The lean-to was reinforced and expanded into a secondary work bay, still modest but functional. The tax appeal resolved in his favor. The zoning board quietly removed his file from the watch list, and the neighborhood association stopped sending mail altogether. One day, Harry noticed that even the drone had stopped appearing, the sky free once again. But not everything returned to what it was. Some things never do. The mail came in a locked box now. The cameras stayed on, though the feeds were no longer checked with the same frequency. His habits shifted, locks checked twice instead of once, backups stored in duplicate locations, every receipt filed immediately, every call documented. It wasn't paranoia. It was memory written into routine, the kind of caution that doesn't fade even when the threat does. He didn't trust peace blindly anymore. He tended to it like a crop, knowing it could be strangled if left untended. He spoke with Joanna only once more, and even that wasn't a conversation. It was a letter, typed and mailed from a forwarding address in another county. It wasn't angry. It wasn't warm. It simply acknowledged the legal finality of their split, referenced the concluded arbitration, and closed with a single sentence. "I hope the space gives you what you wanted." Harry read it once, folded it, and slid it into a drawer he rarely opened. He didn't respond. There was nothing more to say. Whatever reconciliation might have once been possible had drowned under a year of tactics and silence. One evening in October, as the light dipped early and the air carried the scent of wood smoke from a neighboring ridge, Harry stood outside the barn and looked toward the horizon. The grass had begun to yellow. The trees had turned their first shades of red. He wasn't a man given to reflection, but something about the stillness called for it. He thought about how quickly land could become a weapon, how shared space could become a wound, and how the law, for all its slowness, had become both sword and shield in his hands, not because it delivered justice quickly, but because it gave him the time to remain standing until justice became undeniable. He poured himself a drink, sat on the porch with his boots up on the railing, and watched the dark come down. There were no engines idling, no headlights searching, no footsteps pacing just out of view, just wind, just earth. Just the creak of boards beneath him and the soft tick of cooling metal in the barn. And when the quiet finally settled, not as an absence, but as presence, Harry allowed himself to exhale in full. The land was his, and this time no one could park in front of it.